Hello everyone, welcome to this series of videos where I am talking about basics of supply chain management. And today, in the last video, we talked about the idea of strategic fit and achieving strategic fit and the levers that you can pull to affect strategic fit. In this video, we'll talk about the framework of supply chain decisions. So when supply chain decisions are made, either to design a new supply chain, redesign an existing supply chain, or merge two supply chains together, in any of these cases, it is important to know what are the different drivers that drive strategy within supply chains, right? And there are 6 big drivers, and we'll talk about that in this video, right? So when you're making, so we talked about the idea of a competitive strategy and how a supply chain strategy has to be part of a competitive strategy. And once you understand your supply chain structure on the 2 axes that we talked about, which is the uncertainty axis and the efficiency responsiveness axis, once you understand your supply chain structure, you have to realize that when you're redesigning, designing, or merging supply chains, there are 6 important drivers that affect a supply chain. You have facilities, inventory, transportation, information sourcing, and pricing. And as you can see, they were divided into 2 separate pieces: the logistical drivers and the cross-functional drivers. Right. So we'll go through all 6 of these drivers and how they affect supply chain decisions and design in this video. And in the next video, we'll talk about how these affect financial performance of a supply chain. Right. So let's begin with the framework for supply chain decision. So we have these 3 logistical drivers and the 3 cross-functional drivers, and the interactions between these different drivers determine overall supply chain performance. Right. So let's begin with these logistical drivers first. And as you'll notice, as we go through the semester, we will talk about facilities, we'll talk about inventory, we'll talk a bit about transportation, right? We'll talk a bit about information, we'll talk about sourcing. Pricing is the one thing we will not be able to touch upon in this class, but otherwise we'll touch upon most of the drivers of supply chain performance. So let's begin with facilities. So facilities here, they're physical locations in the supply chain network where products are transformed or stored. Now remember that this doesn't have to be just a manufacturing facility or a distribution facility or anything like that. If there is a call center, where the call center is located, a physical location of a facility is also important. If it is an office where people come in and do office work, then where the office is located is important, right? So responsiveness in a supply chain can be increased by increasing the number of facilities. But remember always that the more responsive your supply chain gets, technically the less efficient it is going to get, because the larger it gets, the more unwieldy it's going to be and the harder it is going to be to manage, right? But you're definitely adding responsiveness because we are able to increase capacity within your supply chain, right? So within facilities, there's always a trade-off between facilities, inventory, and transportation costs. So not within facilities, I'm sorry. There's always a trade-off between facility, inventory, and transportation costs, right? So if you have a large number of facilities, you're going to hold a large amount of inventory, right? And your transportation costs are also going to increase. So increasing number of facilities, increasing facility inventory costs, but decreases transportation costs and reduces response time. And this is because now you can have closer, say, distribution centers closer to customers, so you can get final product to your customers much faster, right? At the same time, increasing flexibility or capacity of a facility increases the facility cost, but decreases the inventory cost and response time. So there's always these three dimensional trade-off that's going on, right? But what are the things that go into making a facilities decision? One is understanding the capability of a facility, exactly what's going to happen at that facility. Is it going to be a manufacturing facility? What kind of manufacturing is going to do? Say, for example, if you take any of the large car companies that have factories all over the United States, you have some factories which produce specific types of cars. So if you look at Toyota factories, right, not all Toyota factories will produce all Toyota cars, right? You have larger factories that produce a larger number of cars, but you might have smaller factories dedicated to 1 or 2 product lines because they are the ones that sell the most. Corolla and Camry and Prius, these are the ones that sell the most. Now, a lot of Priuses are not manufactured in the US, they're manufactured in in Japan and then shipped here, but especially for Corollas and Camrys, a lot of them are manufactured here, right? And they have dedicated factories which spend most of their time making these products. Right? So capability is important to know. What kind of products can you make and how much can you make? And of course, location is very, very important, right? Where is this located? And when you're making decisions of location, that is also very important, right? So if you are going to build a brand new factory, where should the factory be placed? The location of because locating a factory is a capital intensive expenditure. You're going to spend a lot of time locating a factory. You're probably going to talk to the local government, get some tax breaks and whatnot. Then people will move into that area to come work at your factory. So lots of different things that are going to happen, and many macroeconomic factors also affect decision, something of a large decision like this, right? So locating a factory is a very, very important part of designing a supply chain. Like I said, capacity is important, and of course, demand allocation. So once products are made at that facility, or once products are transformed at that facility, where are they going to go? Are they going to go to distributors? Are they going to go to customers directly? Are they going to go to retail stores? So all of those things are important to know. So it's a very important idea. And the metrics that are important. So remember that now we are in the realm of descriptive analytics. And when you're talking about descriptive analytics, you need to talk about the metrics that are important. And the facility metrics that are always important are revenue per dollar invested, right? Processing cost per unit. These are all important numbers. Overall efficiency, right? How efficient is a product? And another important one is the volume contribution of the top 20% of SKUs and customers. So that's one metric. The other is inventory cost per square footage, inventory cost per dollar spent on making things. All of this are important, but we'll talk about inventory again in the next one. But sometimes inventory costs are charged to facility costs. So there is that. So let's talk about inventory. So whenever you look at inventory, there are three types of inventory you always have. You have raw material inventory, you have work in process inventory, and you have finished goods inventory, right? And the inventory is important because there's always going to be mismatch between supply and demand. So it's always good to have some inventory on hand to satisfy excess demand that happens once in a while. It's important to exploit economies of scale to reduce costs and all of that. So having inventory is very, very important, and having the right amount of inventory is important. You should not have too much inventory either, because if you have a lot of inventory, you'll incur a lot of inventory costs, and there are other things that can happen in inventory. Inventory can be stolen, it can be broken, it can become obsolete. So storing a lot of inventory also has some negative costs associated with it, right? So increasing inventory generally makes supply chain more responsive, but then again, remember that it definitely makes it less efficient. So just keep that in mind. Okay. And inventory holding costs will increase as you, like I said, as you increase the amount of inventory, right? So a very basic, I would say, an axiom in inventory management is called Little's Law. So Little's Law says that the amount of inventory that you hold depends upon the flow time and the throughput, and it's a very simple thing to understand. Take an assembly line, right? So it says that if an assembly line is working for 100 hours, and an assembly line can make, say, 1 car per hour. So if it's working for 100 hours, it will make 100 cars, and that's the amount of inventory that you have. It's a very simplistic way of looking at looking at Little's Law, because Little's Law is also useful when demand is uncertain. So when you are looking at demand, but demand is not fixed, or the throughput rate is not fixed, right? So a lot of things can happen. So it's very, very interesting to look at Little's Law in many different scenarios, but the simplest application of Little's Law simplest way to understand the Little's Law is to look at it as a result of a fixed facility, right? Right. So what are the components of inventory decision? So these are things, again, we will spend time within the semester to go through all of this. The idea of cycle inventory, we have safety inventory, we have seasonal inventory. We'll spend quite a bit of amount of time on seasonal inventory. And these are the different components of making decisions. So cycle inventory is inventory that you have to keep ordering on a continuous basis. Safety inventory is some extra inventory that you keep in case your demand is very variable. And of course, season inventory is specific inventory that you sell in specific seasons. So things like, let's say, the Super Bowl is going to happen. You know which teams are going to be in the Super Bowl. You print T-shirts saying, let's say it's Eagles versus the Kansas City versus Eagles, right? So you say, okay, you're printing Eagles T-shirts for Super Bowl, saying that Eagles are going to win the Super Bowl and sell a lot of T-shirts, but they are only going to sell for, let's say, a month or a month and a half right after the Super Bowl is done. And then afterwards, other things happen, and then, trades are going to happen, and then camp is going to begin and all of that, and things will move on. But for that particular season, you're going to sell a lot of those T-shirts, right? And the same goes with things like flowers before Mother's Day, or flowers before specific flowers before Valentine's Day, chocolates before Valentine's Day, chocolates before Mother's Day, or chocolates for Easter, and all of these other types, right? So they are seasonally important inventory. Sweaters for winter, but sweaters are not going to be needed in summer. So seasonal inventory is very, very important, and we will spend quite a bit of time on seasonal inventory, right? Now, as part of all of this, some of the important metrics that you look at for inventory is product availability. So what fraction of time are you able to serve your customer demand, right? So other metrics are days of sales in inventory. So how long does it take to sell inventory? Then inventory turns. Inventory turns essentially measures when does your product come in and how long does it take for your product to either become a finished product or to be sold to a customer. So one example of inventory turns is when Lay's makes potato chips, right? So they don't buy potatoes by pounds or by ton either. What they do is they literally have train cars of potatoes that come into Lay's factory. So they literally have large trains with a whole car of train just filled with potatoes, and they measure everything based upon the train cars that come, right? And how long does it take to turn one train car worth of potatoes into the potato chips and then leaves the Lay's factory? Well, that is 8 hours. That's how long it takes, and that's the inventory turns, right? How long does it take for us to turn inventory over from raw material to finished product? So that's for the Lay's factory. But let's say you're looking at a retailer who's selling these Lay's chips. For them, inventory turns is when does Lay's send us the chips? When do they reach at the back of the retail store? And then you put it on the shelf, and then customer buys the potato chips, and all the potato chips that you got from Lay's in a particular batch get sold to customers. How long does that take? And for retailers, that can be anywhere from a week to a month, depending upon their foot traffic in general, right? So that is inventory turns for Lay's chips for that retailer. So it's important to know what inventory turns are. And it's a very, very important metric, right? And that's the idea of how inventory plays a very important decision in supply chain. Of course, transportation, very, very important. It's how things move within a supply chain. It's important thing. And choice of transportation is also very important. Exactly what kind of transportation you're using. But the important metrics in transportation are transportation cost per unit, the inbound transportation time, outbound transportation cost per unit, and outbound transit time. So what we will do for some of the some of the analytical methods that we will learn is we will see how you can use these transportation metrics to actually help locate facility. So facility and transportation decisions can be mixed together, because sometimes where you locate a facility might be dependent upon what kind of transportation modes are available to you, right? So that's something to keep in mind. And of course, information is the first cross-functional driver that we're going to be looking at, and their role in supply chain is to improve the utilization of supply chain assets, right? So information is one thing that you can share with your supplier and with your customer. So let's say that you are a company that is within a long supply chain, and you have a company as a supplier and a company as a customer. In this case, then you can share information with both your supplier and your customer about what kind of demand that do you expect, what kind of new products that you might be making, and things like that, so that they can figure out whether they can change either the supplier needs to supply more items to you, or your customer who's probably going to sell it to further customers can anticipate a higher potential availability of items with you. both. Sharing information is extremely important within a supply chain, right? And one of the important things that we will look at is sales and operations planning, comprehensive information decision. We'll do aggregate planning. So demand planning, aggregate planning, sales and operations planning, these are all very important pieces. And we will talk about demand planning. In fact, that's the next topic that we'll cover in the next week. Then we'll look at sales and operations planning and aggregate planning later on in the semester, right? Okay. And the information metrics are forecast error, which we'll look at, variance from the plan and all of that. The information metrics are really pretty straightforward. Of course, the last two metrics are sourcing and pricing. So sourcing is very important, knowing exactly where your items are going to come from. It's important, and it plays a very crucial role in competitive strategy. So if you remember strategic fit, one of the things we looked at was the supply and demand uncertainty. And supply and demand uncertainty the sourcing has a huge role to play, especially within supply uncertainty, right? If the company that you're getting your supply from is a responsive company versus an efficient company, then you might have a different level of uncertainty coming from them, right? So something to keep in mind. Okay. So of course, one of the important sourcing decisions is to decide whether to outsource or not. Of course, there are other options also. There's a thing called friend-shoring and offshoring. So important things to remember. So people always get outsourcing confused with offshoring. So outsourcing just means that part of your company's supply chain is given to a different company. Say, for example, you're running a flower delivery business. Now, this is actually a real life example. So there was a flower delivery business in San Francisco where this woman who started this company had these beautiful flower arrangements. People would buy them all over San Francisco, and she would have a team of people who delivered them in trucks that she owned herself. But once she opened it up to the rest of California and then to the rest of the country, she could obviously not manage deliveries herself. So she outsourced the delivery portion to a delivery company. I think she did it to FedEx, but I think she was using both FedEx and UPS. But the idea was that part of that business was outsourced to another business. Now, still both UPS and FedEx are American companies, right? So outsourcing doesn't automatically mean that you're taking it outside the country, right? Now, that is offshoring. Now, offshoring can be done within the company itself, and Microsoft and a lot of these tech companies do it all the time. Part of their business is done in offices in London, in Hong Kong, in India, in Vietnam, and all of these other places where they're all Microsoft employees working for Microsoft, but the work is being done outside of the United States, right? So that is offshoring. So offshoring can happen within the same company, but offshoring can also happen. So you can both outsource and offshore at the same time, or you can just do offshoring, or you can just do outsourcing. So don't get these things confused, right? Then, of course, supplier selection. This is a very important piece. And I did my PhD thesis on how you can use auctions to do supplier selection. Very, very interesting. But supplier selection is a very big part of designing a supply chain, of one of the important drivers of supply chain. And the important metrics are, of course, days payables are outstanding, and this we will talk about in a few minutes. What is the average purchase price? What was the supply quality? What is the supply lead time? Supply reliability? So these are all the important sourcing metrics. And finally, the last driver that we'll talk about, and this video is already very long, I'll finish this quickly in a couple of minutes, is pricing, right? So how does pricing affect a supply chain? Pricing affects supply chain because pricing is very important for the responsiveness efficiency spectrum. If your supply chain is very, very efficient, then you can have low prices. But if it's a supply chain has to be responsive, has to be very responsive, given that you are in a certain kind of business, then price cannot be the point that you compete on, right? So pricing strategies must match demand and supply uncertainty, must also match the responsiveness spectrum, right? So things like quantity discounts and low prices versus high prices. So these are all pricing promotions. Now, again, this is also part of sales and operations planning, and we'll talk about that. Now, I don't know if we'll have enough time to do quantity discounts, but we will definitely talk about quantity discounts a little bit. And yeah, so you can have fixed pricing versus menu pricing. You can have variable pricing. Uber and all of these are examples of variable pricing where, depending upon the time of the day, the price might be different for the same product, right? And of course, the important metrics are profit margin and average sales price. So these are all the different important drivers of supply chain performance. And for each of these individual drivers, you have specific metrics that companies track, right? And depending upon how important a particular driver is to the supply chain. Say, for example, you're running a company that is basically a fleet of trucks. The fleet of trucks, the transportation portion and the pricing portion are going to be huge parts of your supply chain. And the rest, while important, are not as important as these two. So the metrics that you will end up tracking will most likely be from the transportation and the pricing drivers, not from the others, right? And so depending upon the company that you have, of the 6 big drivers, a few of these, 1, 2, maybe 3 of these will be the important drivers for your supply chain, and you'll use those metrics to measure how well your company's supply chain is working, right? Now, in the next video, we'll talk about financial performance metrics and how supply chains and supply chain strategies affect financial performance metrics. But that's for the next video. Right now, this video is already too long, so I will stop it here, and I will see you all in the next video. All right, take care.